So today's topic is feminism, and it's such a broad term, and it's my challenge in dealing with feminism is that there are so many iterations of feminism and feminist criticism, and it's hard to differentiate them from legal and political movements, and it's also predicated on an idea of texts and literary theories that are already giving ground on the generic view of literature that I've been trying to push as a viable literary theory that's not predicated on some sort of differentiation within people. So like a feminist literary theory as opposed to a masculinist literary theory. Those are terms from feminists that they will talk about. The prevailing literary theory is masculinist or patriarchal, whatever term you want to use there, suggesting that there is no such thing as a common literary theory. And I'm interested in a common literary theory because I think literature has an enduring appeal and effect on people irrespective of the differentiations to be found among them. And by even using the term feminist literary theory, the adjective, we're tacking against that cultural breeze and suggesting it's an impossibility for there to be a normative literary theory. In which case the human condition is not a shared experience, and we can't really talk about human rights per se. So the difference between men and women, while real, as soon as you assign an adjective to it that suggests a generic distinction, I think undermines the whole project, for which reason I call feminism, with respect to literary theory, an anti-humanist theory. And that might sound pejorative, and I don't mean it pejorative in one sense, but I do think it is deservedly critiqued as removing some of the substance of the whole basis of studying the humanities, and leads to all sorts, and the university's lost in the process. You can't get to a common view of a common nature if you've already determined that women's nature is so different than men's that you have to look at things from a women's perspective. But and when I've lectured on this for many years, it's difficult as a man in a sense, given that context of feminism and the perceived biased or incapability of men to understand a woman's point of view. If you're a man, nonetheless, I have to talk about it because feminist literary theories are important in our day. And even if I'm not in agreement with the anti-humanist perspective, I have to recognize that it's being utilized, and you are, and we have to engage with that. As I said, it's so complicated, though, because there are 4 waves of feminism that are acknowledged in academia. And each of them relates to the previous and yet is different from the others in some way, and we're going to trace the 4 waves of feminism. But they usually begin in the 19th century. First wave feminism begins with figures like Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in response to Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, very influential and important document in the founding of the United States. Thomas Paine and Vindication of the Rights of Man. And that was an assertion against the monarchy and the dependence of the American 13 colonies on Britain at the time, and something of the order of an appeal to the intrinsic dominion of a human being over his own affairs that is not absolutized or taken up in the monarchy. So a vindication of the rights of man as opposed again and to some degree a limitation on the monarch's jurisdiction. And Mary Shelley's riffing on that, it seems to me, in Vindication of the Rights of Women. So that's the way feminism traditionally is discussed, and the first feminist scholar or writer might be Mary Wollstonecraft. We'll get to that in a second when I talk about first wave feminism. But it seems to me that this discussion suggests that before this period that women had no rights. And furthermore, it's implied when you read feminist literature that Christianity is particularly A, patriarchal, and B, hostile towards women. You hear that in a popular fashion, and you read it in the scholars for that matter. So it seems to me that I need to actually just question that narrative, whether it's accurate, and to some degree, without giving an exhaustive history of women and how they've been dealt with in Christianity, at least touch on it to some degree here. So I'm going to do that at the beginning, just to lay out a sort of a template of what's going to happen here. I'm going to talk about women in history in the context of the Western world. I'm not going to deal with the non-Western world. I'll talk about Greece. I'll talk about Rome. I'll talk about the influence of Christianity, and in particular reforms that happened under the Emperor Justinian, the so-called Justinian Code, which I think you'll find interesting. And that's setting a context for women's rights, which is very different and goes contrary to the popular narrative of women lacking rights under Christianity or even under Scripture. But let me start with the first. Legal rights of women in relation to Scripture. So under the Mosaic Law, it's very interesting, and you can read this if you wish. As far as monetary matters go, women and men have basically equal rights. Woman is entitled to her own private property. She's allowed to have land, livestock, slaves, and servants. She can inherit whatever is bequeathed to her in a will upon death, and she inherits equally with her brothers, and in the absence of sons would inherit absolutely everything. So that's the biblical view, which you will find in the Old Testament and Mosaic Law. And a woman can likewise bequeath her belongings to others upon her death. So it's not just that she inherits it and then can't pass it on, she can also pass it on as such. And it would be inherited by her children if she had them, her husband if she was married, or her father if she was single. She could sue in court, didn't need a male to represent her either. So that's the Mosaic Law. And in some situations, you could actually say that women have more rights than men. For example, if you were captive, you had to be ransomed before the male captives in the biblical law. And though sons inherit property, they had a responsibility to support their mother and sisters and to ensure that they were taken care of prior to being able to benefit themselves from the inheritance. And if the estate was wiped out, the boys had to supplement their income from elsewhere. So there was a greater duty placed upon men in that sense, or males. Now, when it came to religious activities, women had fewer opportunities. They weren't allowed to be priests, etc. That's true. But just a very general sketch of the Mosaic Law shows that there is a, broadly speaking, equal treatment under the law with respect to all manner of things, which is very interesting and very much contrary to the state of the ancient world. So let me just talk about that. I'm not going to talk about Greece exhaustively because it differs from state to state, but let's talk about Athens, since it's the most significant for the purposes of Western civilizations. In ancient Athenian law, and this will be the context for the writings of Plato and Aristotle, women lacked many of the legal rights that men did. They are excluded from appearing in law courts. Note the distinction with biblical. They cannot participate in the assembly, in politics. They're legally prohibited from engaging in contracts. There is an expectation that respectable women should not appear or even be talked about in public. If you were in the classical era, again, let's say Plato, Aristotle, women do have a right to divorce, but they lose all rights to any children they had by their husband upon divorce. They lose all rights. That's the state of Athens, of Greece. In Rome, the laws are similarly disadvantageous towards women. The pater familias basically has almost absolute authority over his household. And he can determine who his heirs are, even by decree. His natural born heirs aren't necessarily his heirs. It's who he determines will be his heir. So for instance, very interestingly, Julius Caesar appoints Octavius, Augustus Caesar, as his heir, even though he has no natural relation to him whatsoever. He adopts him as his heir, declares him to be so. Part of the pater familias and the authority of the father over the household. In Rome, there is citizenship, and there are degrees of citizenship. Women can be citizens, but they are second-class citizens. They have limited rights, legal privileges, and protections that render them superior to slaves or non-citizens, but not equal to men. And Roman society in that sense is intensely patriarchal, in the negative sense being described by feminists. They can't vote, they can't stand for public office, they can't serve in the civic priesthoods of the day, and they can't serve in the military in any capacity. They are always under the legal control of some man. Her father, the woman, her husband, or a legal guardian. It's very clear. Now, under Augustus, there's a little bit of transformation here and so forth, but in general, I think this is the portrait. And there is a development and a movement towards equality, roughly speaking, in the Roman period, but in general, the portrait of patriarchy that is presented by feminists of the entire ancient world, or of all of human history up to the point of Mary Wollstonecraft and the first wave feminism, is that women are effectively without property, without voice, without any legal rights, without any acknowledgement of their human nature. Whereas the biblical portrait of women is very different, as I sketched out. It would take a long time, and I'd have to go through the text if we really wanted to do a demonstration of this, but I have to get through feminism in one lecture, and I don't want to do that. But so I'm giving you a summary of it. Importantly, and it seems to me decisively, in the early reign of an emperor by the name of Justinian, Eastern emperor, there's a decisive change. So when does Justinian arise? Justinian is around, when does Justinian come into? 6th century. After Constantine has reigned and brought and made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Emperor Justinian becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he notices that within the various Roman provinces there are different laws in different provinces, because there are different governors, and the different governors enact different laws, and he decides in a reform movement to create a uniformity amongst the Roman provinces to help deal with all manner of issues. And at this point, we have a Christian emperor, and more importantly, we have a Christian empress. And this is very interesting and often ignored. And I never hear feminists talk about it. And perhaps we might want to question why that is. But Theodora, the Empress Theodora, was as influential, if not more influential, than Justinian. Some think that she was the real boss in the situation. You can look into that yourself. She's a fascinating figure in her own right. Former prostitute, converted, and she has enormous influence on the Justinian Code. Without a doubt, and I believe she's a saint in the Orthodox Church, right? Alongside Justinian. So she has a very important role in this. Now, Theodora participates in Justinian's legal and spiritual reforms, and the advances for women's rights is substantial, and she does it in accordance with biblical law. And this is important because in Christendom now, and now I'm talking about East and West, both, there is a move away from the Greco-Roman patriarchal system whereby women have very limited rights and participation per se. So how does this work? She passes laws that prohibit forced prostitution and close brothels. She creates a convent on the eastern side of the Dardanelles where ex-prostitutes can support themselves. She expands the rights of women in divorce and in property ownership. She institutes the death penalty for rape. In Roman law, there is a death penalty for rape, but it doesn't apply to a wide variety of women. It applies to women of the highborn, but you can rape slaves without penalty, and others. The Justinian Code removes all of that. If you're a woman, you've been raped, it's a capital offense. It forbids exposure of unwanted infants, in other words, infanticide. It gives mothers guardianship rights over their own children, and it forbids the killing of a wife who had committed adultery. So these are huge expansions and a Christian response within Rome and application of biblical law to Christendom. And when I say that now, this is important for what comes later. Not only the tendentious portrait of women's rights originating in the 19th century in the hands of Mary Wollstonecraft, who's basically a successor of Rousseau. And the whole idea of atheist modernism coming from that period in the Enlightenment, where human rights are an achievement of the Enlightenment. It steers directly against that, and it contradicts it utterly. And it gives rise to something we're going to notice a little bit later on, and which is a critique of feminism in the third wave of feminism, that when women speak of women's rights, it's Western women that are speaking of women's rights, and they are largely thinking of it in terms as the white liberal women who have the privilege and the wealth to operate in academia. And they speak on behalf of women, and women within around the world will say, but you don't speak on behalf of me. You're very much speaking against a woman's experience. You're speaking on behalf of yourselves, but you don't speak for me, sister. This is a strong pushback. Comes in the third and the fourth wave of feminism, and I'll come to that. But I wanted to just give a little bit of historical context. The whole idea that women's rights begin in the 19th century is wrong. And it certainly does not hold. I'm teaching Shakespeare simultaneously with that. We can already see that there is a notion of the ability to have rights in even pagan Western cultures, such as portrayed in King Lear. But it'll be all over the place. Shakespeare does not portray a patriarchal society the way you would, with the way it's straw-manned in feminist discourse. It's just simply inaccurate. Same thing with Milton. So by the time of, And you'd find the same thing in medieval literature, for that matter, if we wanted to go there. There is clearly an equality understood between men and women insofar as they both bear the image of God, which is a reflection of what biblical law states. And it has a profound influence on culture, Eastern and Western, under Christendom. There's a right to women that is basically entrenched legally for millennia. It's not a new development. And for that reason, and this is interesting as it comes out later, when so the pushback against feminism as it's represented in the first and the second wave comes from within the United States by the so-called womanist feminists. Really done with this. Oh, it's here. I don't read about this term much anymore, but in the 90s it certainly was a term. And these were African American women who said that actually you're not representing the experiences of African Americans at all. You're speaking on behalf of your own identity group, and it's a different one than this. So feminism fragments even within the United States between the whites and the blacks. And that's going to further fragment as we go forward. But this is the first critique of feminism from within the ranks of women, or the first substantial one. But another one emerges almost concurrently with that, and that's from countries that are outside of Christendom. And they'll say that you Westerners, and now they're going to include the Eastern Christendom from this, don't speak of an experience of people that are outside of Christendom. They don't use the word Christendom, but actually that's the difference, is that you assume certain realities about how women relate to the world around them that have the context of Christendom that you're not even acknowledging. And it's very different in Asia, in Africa, and in areas of the world where they don't have the assumed realities that your civilization can simply assume because of the Justinian Code. Because the Justinian Code gets passed on to the law of nations in the medieval period, which is, by the way, is the context for the university. So the early universities arise teaching the Justinian Code. The so-called law of nations is one of the main subjects of interest there. So there's an assumed common law applying to all people. But again, that's a very much of it's predicated on the belief that Christendom reflects a universality of human nature. So even the university has a very much of a Christendom context. And whether a university can exist outside of that, I think is questionable. You first have to assert that human beings, male and female, and including children, and in fact everyone who bears the image of God, has common capacities and has common rights. And outside of Christendom, East and West, they're not there yet. And so imposing these rights against men is not really working very well in countries where they don't even acknowledge the basic human rights. So in China, for instance, they'll say this is a Western concept, human rights. And they're correct. It doesn't mean the Western concept is not true, but it is coming from the West. And when I say the West, now I'm saying the West and the East, including the Orthodox Church and its expansion into Russia and Eastern Europe and so forth. That's the West from the vantage point of the non-West. You would say the same thing in the context of India. And you would say the same thing in the context of much of the world, even in Africa, and we'll get the same issues arising when we come to look at native cultures indigenous to this country. Same sort of thing. Are you talking about a Western way of looking at it, or is there not an indigenous way of looking at this thing? And you're imposing this. And the charge is correct, by the way. You are imposing it or assuming it. You're making certain core assumptions about human nature by suggesting a commonality here. So I think that's important, and it's important for me to contextualize it, because I'm not sure you'll ever hear that anywhere else. Anywhere. even though it's documented and it's easy to trace. Look up the Justinian Code. Look up the Empress Theodora. Look at the reforms she instituted and see how they basically track with the Mosaic biblical law and apply it in Christian culture. And there are all sorts of implications for that, by the way, for Christians when engaging with culture, which is to talk about the importance of Mosaic law ongoing in contemporary discussions. But let me leave that aside. That's the setting that I want to push back against the ideas that I'm going to talk about now coming afterwards, which is the 4 waves of feminism. So let me talk about the 4 waves of feminism. First wave feminism. This is the 3rd wave, womanist feminists. Let's just start with first wave feminism. This is the one that has popular recognition and carries the whole weight of the validity of the feminist movement, quite frankly, to this very day. So the waves are, the strongest wave is at the beginning, and then the secondary and the tertiary, and finally whatever the fourth, what would the fourth be after tertiary? Anyway, the 4th wave is a lesser variation of it. It's more confused, and it's less significant, although it's not less significant for our culture because we're in the midst of the fourth wave now. But the first wave is predicated on legal issues. And specifically, I want to say, and this is important, on legal developments that are in and around the French Revolution. Because come the Napoleonic Code, which governs French-speaking countries, including Quebec, and in Germany, and in areas where Napoleon conquers Europe, there's a different legal code that's imposed here, which is very much more of a rationalist understanding of the law. And this will have bearing, by the way, on the issue of what the text is when we're trying to interpret things. Are we trying to interpret the written text or the spirit behind the text? Is it the reason or is it the word? In the Napoleonic Code, there's a tendency to appeal to reason as opposed to what's written. And because of that, progressivism is inherent in the Napoleonic Code, because there's never anything that is going to indefinitely postpone the advance of the law. There's an assumed bias towards spiritual advance in the Napoleonic Code. In Canada, it's called civic law as opposed to common law. The common law tradition arises out of the biblical law and out of the Justinian Code. But the civic law assumes the principle of the French Revolution and its appeal to reason. Remember, in the Enlightenment, they have a goddess of reason, and Napoleon tries to bring in a more rational world order, including they try to divide the days of the week and propose a 10-day week and so forth. According to the decimal system, it collapses and fails, doesn't work very well, but it's imposed in various other ways, in weights and measures and earthly matters. But it does characterize the way that the world is looked at in the Germanic and in the French area of influence. And that spills over into England, by the way. But roughly speaking, what happens in France and Germany drives feminism in a particular direction, in a spiritualized direction, because it is a spiritualized sense of human nature at all times. Now that's important because when Mary Shelley writes, the daughter of William Godwin, who's an Enlightenment rationalist, as well, by the way, her mother dies in childbirth, or is it Mary who dies in childbirth with, I think it's Mary Wollstonecraft who does when she gives birth to her daughter, Mary Shelley. But there's strong Enlightenment influences here and a belief in the equality of men and women, but it's coming out of a French context and a rationalist context. And it's really odd because in British common law, women do have those rights. roughly speaking. I mean, there are challenges there, but that the idea that women have no rights is absurd. They do have rights under common law, and the rights are that arise out of Scripture, and more or less equal. Now, the inequalities that are there do exist, but they're not of the sort that would characterize Greece and Rome. That's simply inaccurate. But when I say it's focused on legal issues, the legal issues is not that they can't hold property and they can't go to court and they can't represent themselves and they are effectively treated as property under the law. It's related to the right to vote. That's it. The suffragette movement, it's the right to vote. Because in the term, there's a men's suffrage movement in the sense that not all men are given the right to vote in Britain in the 19th century. It was only the aristocrats, those who owned property, who had the rights to vote. Not all men. Now this, if you wanted to go into that, you could look at the Putney debates. In Cromwell's New Model Army, and these are the Republican army that's squaring off against the King's forces, and within their ranks there are some that think that how much are we going to revolt against the King and his tyranny? We're going to go, every man should benefit from this equally. So, and those that espouse this are called the levelers. They want to level all of the inequalities and fight for them, and they're more or less the Democrat wing, if you will, of the Putney debates. On the other side, and the side that actually prevails, the aristocrats and property owning men say, well, until you own property, you're not really responsible for yourselves, and you're not actually able to even govern yourselves, so you shouldn't have an equal right to vote in this sphere. You can look at the Putney debates, it's interesting and like, but the point is, in the 19th century, or even in the 18th century with Thomas Paine's, there's an attempt to move the franchise so that all men have the right to vote. So it's not just, men have it and women don't. There's a push within the ranks of men for all adult males to have the right to vote. And then on the coattails of that, women say, and women should as well. And there's a resistance to that. But there's an equal resistance to the fact that the common man should have the right to vote. But I says, look at the Putney debates if you want to look at that discussion. It's very interesting. It's right on the battlefield within the ranks of the army. There are commoners who are fighting, shedding their blood on the battlefield, and say, I should have the right to vote at the end of this. And among them, the aristocrats, the property owners, say, no, you should not. And they prevail. And under Cromwell, there's a republic, but it's not a democracy that ensues. It's a republic. Democracies, as such as arise in the United States, are part of the leveler movement and to some degree connected with the French Revolution, with a more generalizing and undifferentiated. Now, which one is more biblical? That's a very interesting discussion. That's to some degree the difference between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. And it's not related to bearing the image of God, because both parties are going to agree to that. The question becomes a prudential one, which is what's the best way for a republic or a society, a body politic, to govern itself? Should it be property owners who have skin in the game who get to vote, or should it be everyone, however bad their conduct is, whether they're a criminal or whether they're a saint, should they have an equal right to vote? And therein lies the debate. The Democrats will push in terms of everyone in every place, and that now they're going to extend it to those that are born outside the United States, to everyone who sets foot on the soil, foreigners and so forth. And that's why they don't want voter ID, right? That's a live political issue in the U.S. because they're saying there's something important here at stake, namely the humanity of everyone who comes into the country, irrespective of whether they're citizen or not. So they want to get rid of all differentiations and degrees. even between citizens and non-citizens. It's happening in Canada as well, as we speak. People are being imported into the country under this same idea. But the first wave feminists are focused on the right to vote, and it's used synonymously with a kind of feminism espoused by liberal women's rights movement with roots in this. Now, this phrase, the first wave feminism, actually doesn't exist until the second wave does. Because the second wave want to talk about how it was to this point, and now let's, differentiate what's going on from here on. So the first wave, and it's to some degree because the first wave was successful. Women have the right to vote in Western democracies, politically. It has got nothing to do per se, although this will arise within it, whether women should be involved in the workplace equally and have that. That's a later development. It's not the same issue. And note in Mary Shelley's day, it doesn't even occur to her to advocate for this. It would make no sense because women cannot work in the workforce on equal ground with men if they're going to have children. They simply can't. It's biologically impossible. If they're going to have children, they can't be in the same, so they don't consider it. It develops into an issue once birth control arises, at which point women can be liberated to some degree from their biology, can choose not to have children, and to some degree it'll be connected with the abortion movement as well. But that's going to be second wave feminism. So let me talk about second wave feminism. Second wave feminism is largely enabled by biotechnology. The pill, birth control, so the suffragette movement has succeeded. Women have the right to vote, but they don't consider equality in every sphere, in every context, in every situation, because it goes against the nature of women to want to do those things. But once the technology is there, some women will want that, and they claim it on behalf of all women. And so then the question will arise, does this actually represent women? Or does it represent some women against other women? And one of the things that arises in abortion, or even in birth control, is that by enacting using this form of technology, you are depriving women of life. You're preventing them from being born, or you can kill them. You can commit abortion, and you can even commit gendercide, right? So you can specifically target towards women, an issue that's arisen in recent times politically. The technology can actually, even though women are upholding the right to do with their body as they choose, they're doing it specifically against women, particularly, and this is interesting, outside the Western world, outside the context of Christendom. In some countries, they prefer male-born because their laws, their customs will mean that unless it's a male, they're not going to inherit the property. And so they want a man to carry on the family legacy. So this is why I wanted to frame it and extend the frame outwards beyond the usual frame, because I think it's helpful. But second wave feminism, so first wave is, let's say, early 19th century, but you could say even 18th century, but early 19th century, first wave. Second wave, 1960s. Sexual revolution. Early 60s takes about two decades, this wave. And it takes place throughout the Western world. I can't speak of how it affects the Eastern world, because the Eastern world largely falls under communism. And there's a different dynamic there. And I think they're probably ahead of the West on this, because communists regard everybody as a worker, men and women, right? Because they're comrades, they're workers. And so they're already pushing their society in the direction that Western society is soon going to follow. So I think to some degree, although it's not going to be true of Eastern Orthodoxy in the Southern climes, where communism rules, women's rights in terms of equality in the workplace and in other areas is going to be more advanced because it's more in keeping with the French Revolution and the egalitarian motif. So let me compare the two. In the first wave feminism, it's mainly focused on suffrage and overturning the legal obstacles to women's inclusion in the voting process. But whereas second wave feminism broadens the debate to a much broader range of issues, to sexuality, to the realm of the family. So note that the one is in the public sphere. The first is in the public sphere, women's rights, the right to participate in the public sphere, the area of politics. The second wave moves it into the private sphere. There's the shift. And it will include reproductive rights, de facto inequalities, even if they're not legal. There's differences between the sexes. It will include things like women's roles, whether women should be, the ideal female vocation should be in the home, or whether it should be the same as men. And in the second wave, they in general say we should be the same as men. So it's a communist, and they're in agreement with the communists on this. And even official legal inequalities. And it uses the word patriarchal, even though there's no patriarchy anymore per se. But the word patriarchy becomes used as a slur against those that question the incursion of the egalitarian motif from the public square to the private. And second wave feminism will talk about domestic violence, marital rape crisis centers, etc. They'll talk about marital rape and so forth. That would have largely been left untouched even under biblical context. It's a very difficult thing to determine. How can you determine rape? You have to have a witness. All crimes require witnesses. Well, in a private context, there are no witnesses. It's her word against his in very complicated situations. But women will talk about this, and we see the rise of feminist-owned bookstores and credit unions and restaurants, and there's a social development of this, right? But it excludes, and I do want to move on here with a bit, this second wave feminism is still largely white, female, rich, privileged, highly educated, and it comes from the academic institutions, so from the Yales and the Princetons and the Harvards and so forth. And they speak on behalf of women, and they're talking about the things that have allowed them to be in the situation they're in, namely the fact that they can use birth control and not have children and pursue a career path. And some women, while some women want to do that, the majority of women are not going to want to do that, nor can do that. But for these women to not only advance their rights, but to secure them, they need a larger group demographic than simply a few white, rich, privileged women. They have to speak on behalf of all women, right? Because otherwise you have no political capital. You have to create a sufficient groundswell. And so they speak on behalf of women. The third wave begins when, as I say, there's a pushback against this. And it's roughly speaking the 80s. But let's say the 1990s. There's some in the 80s, but let's say the 1990s. This is the third wave of feminism, and it is prominent and grounded in the civil rights movement. It's largely women born in the 1960s and 1970s, my generation. And they talk about diversity, and they talk about individualism in women rather than generic woman, as of being a woman where had no differentiation between them. And it wants to redefine what it means to be a feminist. It said we've had enough of the white Germaine Greer types that speak on behalf of women. Enough of that. Enough of Simone de Beauvoir, who in The Second Sex. Let's talk about all women, because the experience of being female is much more complicated than you white, childless women want to present. And you get new advances in this and different phrases attached to it And there's all sorts of things, and this is where for the first time intersectionality will emerge as a descriptor, because they'll talk about, yes, being a woman, but also being a black woman, and they can further parse it out being a black lesbian woman, or a black lesbian non-native born, or a black lesbian non-native born non-Anglophile, or English speaking. And so that's the intersectionality. You have various pieces as a part of your identity. Your identity is being parsed out and differentiated from this sort of vanilla form of feminism where everybody's white. Now you have the Baskin-Robbins, however many flavors, right? So so there's a fracturing of female identity here, and reflecting more of an individualized understanding of a woman's experience, which, quite frankly, the door is open once you even postulate a feminist movement and say women as opposed to men. The biblical view is that women and men equally bear the image of God. And so there is no differentiation. It's to be a human being. You can be a male, you can be a female. There is some differences because male and females are different, and there are different roles and there are different duties that come with them. I mean, women can have children, can bear children, and men can't. And we saw in biblical law there are certain obligations that are placed upon men as a consequence of this, and it's a higher bar, quite frankly. Women who inherit property don't have the same duty. They don't have to look after the brothers. They don't have to look after other things, but men who are born do have to. There's a greater responsibility there that comes with headship, and headship is not the same thing as patriarchy, by the way. But at any rate, and third wave feminism, intersectionality arises, and then you'll get other phrases like sex positivity and postmodern feminism. I'm going to look at this more closely when we move to so-called cyborg feminism with Donna Haraway in a couple classes. We'll look at cyborg feminism, because at that point it will include something that is going to point us in a little different direction, but I think is important, namely transhumanism and even post-humanism. But I think in general, third wave feminism is related to this idea of intersectionality, and critics have said the problem with third wave feminism is that it is ill-defined and perhaps can't even be defined. So in other words, is it actually a thing at this point? I mean, it almost lacks definition. In fact, that's what it tries to do, is push back against the prevailing definitions. It's chaotic. It is probably connected to the appearance. It's now connected very strongly to politics, and specifically the politics of the United States. And I would say that from this period onward, the whip hand of cultural determination across the Western world comes from the United States and its political movements. The identity politics, which becomes the marker of the Democrat Party, starts to bleed over into the academy, or maybe it comes from the academy. There's a hand-in-glove thing going on here. And we can't discount the influence of cultural Marxism in this either. Because remember, the cultural Marxists regard the family as the main obstacle to the workers' revolution. Families didn't want to overturn the authorities because the establishment, they were part of the establishment just simply by having families. The families were acknowledged in the law, and they didn't want to do what the communists did, which is to burn everything down, or do what the French revolutionaries did, which is to execute everybody in authority and then put new tyrants in their place, because that just is what happens. It's a restraint, in other words, on the revolution. But the third wave feminism extends it, and it's probably identified with a woman by the name of Anita Hill, who testified against a Clarence Thomas. She said that Judge Clarence Thomas had harassed her, and then she appeared as a black woman before an all-male, all-white judiciary committee, and just the symbolism of this was political gold. and she objected to his being named to the Supreme Court. Now he's on the Supreme Court. By the way, do you have is that a question? No, you just no. Okay. And I'll quote from this. Third wave credited to Rebecca Walker responds to Thomas's appointment to the Supreme Court with an article in Ms. Magazine, MS. Note that designation of the period, not really much used anymore. So feminists object to Ms., which they themselves coin. Becoming the Third Wave, 1992. She writes this: "So I write this as a plea to all women, especially women of my generation. Let Thomas's confirmation serve to remind you, as it did me, that the fight is far from over. Let this dismissal of a woman's experience move you to anger. Turn that outrage into political power. Do not vote for them unless they work for us. Do not have sex with them. Do not break bread with them. Do not nurture them if they don't prioritize our freedom to control our bodies and our lives. I am not a post-feminism feminist. I am the third wave." So it will speak of layers of oppression that will be brought about through gender and race and class, and it will express itself culturally in all sorts of ways. But at this point, as I say, this is feminism, which up to this point is largely white and largely generic, although it was radicalized here and brought into the private sphere. So maybe I should put this here. Here it's public, and it's just suffrage movement. And then it's brought into the private sphere, the family, in the second wave. And then it starts to fracture, or it says it adds, it's more inclusive, but actually it fractures, because now it's women against women, and nobody can adjudicate which women's rights are correct. So you just include them all. So rather than talk about the specific intersectional things, we'll talk about inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, as we use it today. But here we see the fragmentation of identity in the third wave of feminism, but it will include everything here. But this has already been done. It's been brought into the private sphere of the family, and now it's brought into between women and women. And we'll suggest that any opposition to this, which is represented by white women, is against all women. So as I say, bodily rights are strongly emphasized here. So the abortion movement becomes basically the sacred ground of the feminist movement. It's rooted in that. I could talk further about that, and maybe I should, but the very strong, even in the first wave of the abortionist movements, such as those of Planned Parenthood, in the writers, that they need to control the family if they're ever going to gain the political power that they want. Planned Parenthood is a political movement connected to eugenics, and initially targeted against blacks. It's a racist movement. Its origins, you won't hear about this in Planned Parenthood, but Margaret Sanger is a racist, and she puts the abortion clinics right in the midst of the ghettos. That's where they're placed. So it's used as a weapon against the very intersectional group that is going to speak as if the women's movement was a common emancipatory movement, when it's clearly intended for something else within their own ranks. And abortion is far less women-friendly than it's presented by those that advocate for it as essential to the women's rights movement, including our current Prime Minister. It's unthinkable. And note, they just passed a healthcare policy, and they're not sure it's going to cover dental, but it does cover reproductive rights. That's the first thing that the healthcare bill is going to cover. We're going to make sure it covers reproductive rights, whatever that means. It's basically, we can go on killing and we're going to fund it. And that's under the guise of health. So that's the third wave. The fourth wave, and I'm giving you a timeline. The timeline is probably correct. Fourth wave is your generation. It's 2010 onwards. Characterized by the empowerment of women. Now, it's more, so let me just put it here. Marxist. Full-on Marxist at this point. It's about the empowerment of women. It's about preferential hiring of women. We're making sure that women are in every position of power. Equal representation on all sorts of boards, including corporate boards. We have to make sure that women are represented there in every possible way. It now connects to the use of the internet. Couldn't have done so before this period, really, because the internet had not expanded to that point, and the smartphones and all that. And it will continue to emphasize very strongly this feature of intersectionality, very strongly. But now it will fragment, and it will exhibit one of the dynamics that emerges from the 1960s onwards, namely the distinction between sex and gender. And women will now include anyone who identifies as a woman. Because remember, if the whole ethos and movement within feminism had been anti-humanist, and women was a rational construct against the natural limitations of the sex, limitations, by the way, which don't denigrate it, but just simply say this is the nature of women, then this movement is going to push strongly against all of the things that have arisen before it to some degree. So equality that is promoted for women in, let's say, competitive sports or in operating in the public square, in the various forms of identity, now the idea of what is a woman will be one of the main questions in this period. And the answer is whoever identifies as a woman, because it's in your mind. If you feel like you're a woman, then you are a woman. And there's no way for them to push back against this movement. This is the legacy of a movement that was powerful politically and is now out of control. And they can't stop it. And it's very ironic that the women's rights movement, which begins here and goes from the public to the private, which includes the context of the family and the male and the female necessary for the family to bear children and so forth, the downstream consequence of this is the destruction and attack on all of the gains of the women before this. But particularly in these spheres. In the public suffrage, doesn't matter if you identify as a woman and you're a man and you want to run for politics. It doesn't really matter. But it does matter intensely in this area. So the reproductive rights will now start to include men wanting to be given wombs and to give birth and to be talked about as menstruating and so all this sort of stuff. So now we're into biopolitics and biofeminism. And to some degree, what I talked about, cyborg feminism. I'll dedicate a separate lecture to Donna Haraway's essay on cyborg feminism, because feminism now becomes a construct. Before, it was a natural identity noted in every culture across the world. You're born male and female. The question is, do you bear the image of God being a female? In most cultures, the answer is no. In fact, in most cultures, it's also no for men, but it's particularly not towards women, or they're disadvantaged politically and socially. But by this point, we have a movement that is turned against itself. You know, you're never going to hear this because by and large within the feminist movement, it sees itself as progressive. But now it can't even define what progress is. Because if progress for women's rights now turns against the very nature of what a woman is, then how can this be progress? What's the standard of defining progress? But in this, we will start to see other forms of feminism that you will note, such as vegetarian ecofeminism and trans feminism and postmodern feminism and blue feminism. Have you heard of blue feminism? No. Sorry. Well, it's okay because it's not significant yet, but it may well be, because blue feminism is a subset of ecofeminism and it relates to the ocean and the bodies of water and so forth. Because if you can't differentiate a person from an animal, from a artificial intelligence or a machine, what you are is they're going to advance an idea of life which is human life is hostile to being a person. This is why I need to talk about this in a discrete lecture of my own. Human life and female life now is not seen as being a person, but rather seen as an organism just like any other. Now it pushes against the biblical definition of human nature, and specifically the Trinitarian formulation of that in discussions of the Trinity in the 3rd, 4th centuries, where a human being is a person because God in his nature is a person. It's not just an entity, he's a person, tripersonal. Human beings, again in the Western world and in the Eastern, let's say in Christendom, are in the first order considered to be persons. By the time we get to here, it's not yet here, but by the time we get to here, this idea of woman, and particularly as a person, starts to go. The impulse or the impetus is rational, destroying all differentiation, including all things. But the end effect is to destroy the validity of human nature as a personal one, an individual one that we share in common. So it's a direct, when I said it was anti-humanist from the outset, the anti-humanism starts to be experienced more obviously by everyone at this point, including women. But at this point it seems to be wholly on women's, in women's favor. And everybody is going to say, well, I'm a feminist, yeah, I think that women should have the right to vote, etc. Most people will say that. I think there's a case to be made against it in certain senses if you want to appeal to the idea of having property and the responsibilities and rights that go with it. I think there's a case to be made there, but by and large, it's so out there as an academic topic, even if it's an important one, that we don't even need to go into that area right now as a discussion. Let's just say, though, that the idea of the public expression of women in terms of being given a right to vote just reflects a Christian notion that women bear the image of God equally. So we're going to agree to that. Whether it's the most prudent way to go forward is another one, but we'll agree with that. By the time it gets put into the private sphere, in the family sphere, there's where the culture wars begin. Right here. Right? Here's where the big culture wars begin. Because now you're dealing with the definitions that arise outside of the law, but now you're bringing the public square into the private. And an intrusion has happened. And if you're going to bring the public square, into the private sphere, you're going to need things like cameras in houses to monitor and so forth. There's an intrusion there, and the public's going to want to know and to prove that, and you're going to bring the technology in to enforce a certain view of human nature, which the communists may be happy with, but most people are not. Anyway, but as I say, there's so this is predicated also on the pill and prophylactic measures to prevent human beings from occurring, and also predicated on the legitimacy and importance of the abortion movement. 1960s, second wave feminism. Third wave is going to start to break it down, and by the time we get to the fourth wave, all of human nature is up for grabs. And this is an experiment or a movement that has spiraled seriously out of control, and the very notion of of humanities is actually under assault by the feminist movement. It's just simply under assault. And you hear prominent women objecting against it. Let's say J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter series, speaking against of the women's right movement, against those that are speaking as women as something, a constructed thing. Speaking strongly. And she's not alone. There are other women that are speaking. The women are, I guess, the best spokesmen for this movement. But I would say that the whip hand still remains politically with those that are advancing this. And why is that? Well, it's because of a later development which is concurrent with this, which is the advent of post-humanism and transhumanism to some degree. Because the post-humanist movement regards the idea of human life as distinct from the rest of life to be a questionable premise. And not only is it questionable, they oppose it. They don't think that human life is sacred, and they think that as a consequence that it's okay to desecrate it, and that's how we will demonstrate our commitment to our principles, is we will destroy life, we will prevent life from happening, we will encourage people not to have children, and we will see the advance of it. And if you want to look at demographics, they will reflect the advance of the feminist movement, so that now we are not even replenishing our population. We have a sort of demographic time bomb happening. It's in here. It begins back in here, really, to some degree, but it really takes on teeth at this point. And that is found not only in the Western world, it's now also wherever Western society has been brought into contact with the East. If they gain the political and economic advances of the West, there is a correspondent lack of birth rate. So in South Korea, it has gone below, you don't even have one child for two. Same thing in Japan. Very Eastern countries, it's the most advanced in the culture of death. I call it a culture of death. But I prefer to call it a culture of suicide and death. It's a death and suicide cult at this point. Suicide because it's just as liable and happy to take its own life as it is to kill others. But it's predicated now on killing. Killing is the defining feature of human nature. It's the culture of Cain. But I'll talk about that more next time. Any comments or questions? As I say, I've talked about it as a political, social, cultural movement. You can imagine, given those different expressions here, how texts are going to be seen. And they're going to be seen at this point when you come to the intersectionality. It's going to be a very confused understanding of what a feminist view of a text is, and so forth. Yes?
In biblical criticism, is there a connection between this movement and the sort of innovation of an egalitarian conception of women and men?
What do you mean exactly?
From an interpretation of Scripture, it appears before a certain period in history that there is an understood role that the man had as a head of the house. You see that in Milton, for example, and the wife is submitting to the man as the head, as an analogy of Christ, or an image of Christ in the church. And then in the church, the man is supposed to be the shepherd of his people, imaging Christ.
That's reflected in biblical. So I talked about the equality under biblical law, but there is differentiation as well. So women can't be priests.
Yeah.
They can't be the Levitical of the Levitical order.
Is the view, I guess, contrary to what you would call complementarianism, egalitarianism, is that drawing out of this?
So the debate in Christian circles, whether you're an egalitarian or a complementarian, it probably arises out of this, the same sense. Yeah. Because in Scripture it's quite clear that there's a differentiation in terms of priestly service between men and women. And an assumed importance of the family. I think that also is often neglected in these discussions. because it ends up being a workplace discussion, and it excludes what's the most basic feature of human life that is a pre-political thing, and that is to have a family. You don't have to ask somebody to have a child. You don't need permission. And at that point, you have a cultural unit that is pre-political, like Adam and Eve. They had children before there was a city. Cain and Abel. Cain's the first. He's the originator of the city, and we can talk. I'll have to talk about that. But yes, to some degree, that it's a pre-political. It's a matter of the private sphere. No culture, by the way, that ever survives it wants the public square to be involved in the private sphere, let alone determine it, because it's going to destroy it. It recognizes that the state can't exist if there's not a healthy home, if the family unit's not protected, if people cannot look after their own children in a way that they determine best and in a loving fashion and so forth, society will not exist, because the time of maturation is so long for human beings that it's impossible to give to each individual. And again, here's a biblical notion that's important here. Each individual bears the image of God, needs love, and needs love in an enduring way over a long period of time in order to mature and become a proper image-bearing individual. They need that love in an intimate way over a very long, within the context of a family. It's necessary. If you take that away and bring the public involved in it and demand universal education, which we have in the public school movement, and that pushes in against parental rights here of the private determination, the parents as the first educators and so forth, it creates serious social consequences that are destructive to everyone. And there is no, as I say, there's no limit to that, the destructiveness there. So it's not just about abortion and birth control. It has to do with which is the dominant institution culturally. Is it the state or is it the family? And since the since Rousseau and the Enlightenment philosophers, the assumption here is that there are two units at odds with one another that are to be understood sociologically. One, there's society, and the other is the individual. The individual in the society, and the individual asserts his rights autonomously. He has an autonomy which he's going to express. Whereas, from a biblical perspective, those are not there are mediating institutions that need to be considered in the discussion, and the primary one is the family. Individuals do not exist autonomously or solipsistically, or can be seen as having any integrity on their own, because we don't attain our full capacities until we mature, at which point the law applies to us, and that takes a very long time. And so the family is necessary for the individual, and the family is necessary for the extension of the social goods and so forth. So you can't appeal to the social goods of suffrage at the expense of the social good of having healthy families. That would have been understood before the 1960s, by the way. And now it is no longer. Now it's a political issue between the so-called left and the so-called right. All very complicated things, but yes, I think that is there in the egalitarian versus complementarian movement. They make it as if it's all about workplace, and that's one issue, but it's not even the most important issue. The most important issue is how do we express a view of women's rights that relates to the function of the family, and men that relates to the function of the family. That's it needs to put. And not to be about, but note that this begins with a public square, and the public square now overrules all this. So there needs to be a recalibration and a discussion of that. I know it's happened in Catholic circles in particular, less so in Protestant, to my frustration, but it's there. But at stake is the idea of being a person and bearing the image of God. and all the consequences that go through it. Any other questions or observations? I'd say it's a super general discussion. Yes?
Well, just like the push for having women clergy, and I know it depends on denominations, right?
Some resist it entirely.
Yeah. Would that have been tied to a particular way of feminism, or is that an independent sort of movement?
So in liberal Protestantism, where it's first embraced, and it comes from certain, it tends to come from movements that are more low church, if you will, and more related to the aims and motivations of the levelers. Go back to the Putney debates that I talked about in the New Model Army. Those that were on the side of the levelers would be the Congregationalists in their church polity and so forth. The congregation determines the governance of the church, as opposed to the Presbyterian, where it's going to be a group of elders, or the Episcopalians, where it's going to be a bishop. So your church polity is going to affect all these things. So in general, the egalitarian movement in churches arises from those church movements that are more where the rule tends to be posited in the people as opposed to the clergy, if you will. That's where it begins, and is advanced in more so the radical Reformation. So the Reformation has two phases, really, in some ways. You get the magisterial reformers, the Calvins, the Luthers, the Melanchthons, and so forth. And then you get the radical reformers, the Anabaptists, that are going to make church polity more congregationalist and more everyone who is a member has a right to a vote and an involvement in church decisions and so forth. So it leans towards egalitarian already, and it tends to express itself and is on the front line of advancing women in the clergy. But the others, because of the cultural influence of the 1960s and so forth, it pushes into all of them. But I'd say the first one to spring on board are those that are more congregationalist in their polity. But now you see in Anglicanism, you see women bishops. But back in the 90s, when I was in Britain, that was a debate whether women should be bishops. Even when they allowed women as clergy, they said, we're not going to allow women as bishops. And I said, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. If women can be clergy, why can't they be bishops? Well, because of the Episcopalian structure. The episcopos, the bishop, was considered to be, in some sense, a different order of Christian to the other Christians and so forth. So they said, as long as there aren't any women bishops, we can have women in clergy. And I said, that doesn't make any sense to me. But so if you're going to admit women in clergy, then you have to admit them into the bishopric. But I'm not an Episcopalian. But that's how it began. Well, now we have women who are bishops in the Anglican Church, and it won't be long before we eventually have an Archbishop of Canterbury and so forth in the Anglican Church of England circles, at any rate. Within Anglicanism, now there's been a split, Anglican Communion, so that most of the Anglican Communion doesn't recognize the Church of England. The Church of England's followed this impulse in every way. But in Africa, where the majority of Anglicans reside, they're saying, we're not having this at all. And we're going to hold the line on this. And it's called the egalitarians versus the complementarians. There's more at stake than this. It's not just about women in the church, as C.S. Lewis wrote about it in a famous essay. It's not about women in the clergy. There's more connected to that. There's a whole train of issues related to the public and the private, and the legitimacy of the private as opposed to the public, and the defense of the realm of the family in that whole mix. But it's all, does the Word of God, what does it say there? What is it written? And if you're going to emphasize what's written, then you're going to oppose the rationalist movement that says it doesn't matter what's written, it matters what's reasonable. And what's reasonable now includes whatever somebody says, whoever someone says is a woman. That's the rationalist, because it opposes all definitions. It regards them as obstructions to the advance of the spirit, the holy spiritual. And it actually is a sort of a religion now. It is a sort of spirituality. Does that help at all? Yeah, it's okay. I'm done for today as far as the lecture.